Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good morning. As most of you by now, I think, know, my name is Rachel Peterson, and I'm program lead for the Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative. And welcome back to all of you who have been joining us for the past 2 days. And for those of you who are joining for the first day, welcome. I especially want to welcome Michael Marder, who has arrived, who we missed dearly, and who many of you are eager to meet. So we're happy to have you and looking forward to your talk later. Looking out at the audience, it looks like we may have lost some people in the Arboretum. But I'm okay with that, as long as they're still there thinking with plants and fungi. In my very brief remarks this morning, I'm going to attempt to chart a little bit of where we've been and where we're going, and time permitting may offer a bit of a reflection as we head into this morning's conversation about the colonial roots of plant thought and plant studies. Day one, we began with a contemplation about science with Merlin, what it is, what it isn't, its relationship to the unassimilable. Does science is its ultimate promise to explain the unexplainable? And we answered these questions with the help of Goethe, Whitehead, Ted Lasso, as well as a few cartoons thrown in from Liz van Valkenburg for good measure. And then we transitioned into a conversation about the latest and the greatest in plant science, and we had calls to recognize the ways in which we can be trapped in our anthropocentric or zoocentric ways of thinking, which may or may not actually help us apprehend the weirdness of the things that plants do. What is science and what isn't was the question that Liz van Valkenburg posed yesterday. And it was interesting to keep that question in mind as we transitioned into looking at folks, scientists like Lynn Margulis and Agnes Arber, scientists, deep, rigorous scientists who also operate within theological and aesthetic modes in order to better approximate and make sense of the phenomenon they observe. And we were reminded that the line between science, art, and humanities is blurry, and it's also a relatively recent distinction historically, and a culturally situated one. And then we took a bold speculative turn. I don't see anyone wearing 3 pairs of glasses, so it looks like Emanuele is not here yet. We took a bold speculative turn that upended our thinking about the relationship between forests and cities, and he playfully invited us into a contemplation about how life could be different and may be different, how we might build differently if we worked within vegetalizing modes of love, of grafting, and if we understood, in his words, that every city is a result of unbridled and crazy love that humans have for plants. And then we turned our eyes and our noses towards engagement with plants and fungi in art, exploring how the whole of Western art and its purported realism in depicting plants is really just holding up a mirror through which we understand ourselves. And we were invited into a more generative and generous rethinking of what Giovanni terms vegetal realism. And finally, we ended with a delightfully, deliciously, and disgustingly strange invitation into the sensuous, into the contemplation of the kind of synesthetic life that plants and fungi invite us into, the sounds made by swarms of bees, as well as the stench that is inseparable from that sound. And we continued to follow that fungal scent yesterday morning with Giuliana's fantastic exploration into the historical and ongoing relationships humans have with fungi. And she introduced us into a new word, funga, flora, fauna, and funga, which we all promised to say and keep saying and make it cool. So please hold up your end of the bargain for that. And she also introduced us to a new phrase that she returns to, ayuda a vivir, which means to help live. And I think she ended with a really thoughtful reflection on how she can help do so in her own research, considering the free, prior, and informed consent of the communities she's working with. And we transitioned from there into a conversation about ethics, and how rethinking can bring us into how we are forced to rethink and come into contact with crises through our relationships with plants and fungi, and how there's this possibility from ecological gardening to new cold chain innovations to rethink a better future with plants and fungi. And we heeded a very sharp warning not to romanticize fungal metaphors and not to assume that simply having a knowledge of interconnection will necessarily usher us into moral frameworks of action. And it made us all perhaps a bit more vigilant in assuming that simply looking at the world differently will make us behave differently. But then Rebecca McMacken reminded us that actually very small changes in our behavior can make a big difference. We don't have to be saviors, we can be pragmatists. We can, for example, leave the leaves, and in doing so, have a profound impact on the many species and organisms in our environment. And though gardening requires a lot of killing, she reminded us that at minimum, we can at least know the beings we are killing. We can be aware of organisms that have evolved together in the land, and when we have access and right to that land, we can do our best to steward those organisms and their relationships together. Rebecca left us with, I think, a really beautiful image that I want to invoke as we're moving into this morning and discussing the colonial roots of plant studies. Rebecca told us that she is currently taking cores of soil from her land and actually going down, taking samples from each strata and seeing what plants grow. So literally going back in time and seeing what sort of beings thrive in each of these strata throughout history. And I think that's a little bit of what we'll be doing this morning with Banu's talk and the panel that will follow. And we will be, invited to examine what forms of thought around plants, around people and their relationship with plants, have thrived or been neglected throughout history. So, for the sake of time, I want to transition immediately into Banu's talk now, and I can think of no one better to take us through those strata of soil and help us think through what kind of thought around plants has thrived or not, and why. And to get to Banu's talk, I want to welcome to the stage Andrea Sanchez Castañeda, who will introduce Banu. Andrea is a postdoctoral fellow in religion and indigenous plant medicine traditions at the Americas at the Center for the Study of World Religions here at Harvard Divinity School. She is a cultural anthropologist working in the fields of critical indigenous studies and urban environmental studies, particularly in Latin America. Her research focuses on the ontological dimensions of indigeneity, territory, nature, and the sacred of the Mayusca of Sabu, an indigenous community located in Bogota, Colombia, with whom she has collaborated throughout her master's and doctoral research for more than 8 years. Andrea earned her PhD in Global and Sociological Studies, anthropology track, and her MA in Religious Studies from Florida International University, and she has been a member of the Global Indigenous Forum at the same institution. It's my great pleasure to welcome up Andrea, who will introduce us to Banu. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. For me, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Rachel, for the introduction, and for me, it's a pleasure to be here introducing our distinguished speaker today. Banu Subramanian is the Luella Lamer Professor of Women and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. Trained as a plant evolutionary biologist, Banu engages the feminist studies of science in the practices of experimental biology. Author of Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism, Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, and Ghost Stories of Darwin, the Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity. Banu's current work focuses on decolonizing botany, nativism in plant biology, and the relationship of science and religious nationalism in India. We are very honored to have Banu with us today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Subramanian.
Humans are bodies in motion. We move with our hands and legs, on prosthetics and wheelchairs, on horses, donkeys, and camels, on ships, trains, and automobiles. Muscles propel motion. Hearts beat, blood circulate, food digests, lungs respire. Our bodies move atop continents forever in motion. Using the power of indeterminate growth, plants also are constantly in motion as their limbs seek sun-soaked canopies and roots move deep and wide in search of water and nutrients. Plant pollen and seeds disperse afar through the human, and more than human and elemental life. Fungal hyphae span the earth. In short, life in Darwin's majestic and tangled gardens, clothed with plants, singing birds, flitting insects, and crawling worms in damp earth, continues to celebrate a vibrant, embrangled life, forever inventive, ingenious, and playful. Years ago, I would have agreed that plants seem an odd focus to revisit histories of colonialism. But research for my recent book astonished me. Understanding plant worlds through history reveals how central plants were to colonialism and vice versa. Early in my biological education, I learned that plants are mobile, using their muscles and skeletons to move, while plants are stationary, rooted in place. Today, I question the work that such narratives do. The history of colonial botany is a story of more than plant worlds, how some plants, animals, and colonized humans were used by and for the colonial project. By centering the plant, we see how colonists remade plants in their image for their need, consumption, profit, and for empire. By separating the world into nature and culture, biology elides the role of the human on the environment. We need to bring the human back into the natural and nature-cultural world. We also need to be mindful not to talk about the human as though it's a self-evident unitary category. After all, some anthropos of the Anthropocene conquered and colonized other anthropos. I use the term embrangled instead of entangled or intertwined to capture the state of being embroiled and mired in something. Interdisciplinarity can help us understand the fraught history of nature-cultural embranglements, and in so doing, introduce generative alternates to the study of global flora and invasive species. But first, let us ask, what did colonizers do to the land and its inhabitants? And here, Leanne Simpson is very useful, and she argues, really what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant, animal, and minerals have spirit and therefore agency? And she answers in three. One, you use gender violence to remove indigenous peoples and their descendants from the land. Two, you remove agency from plant and animal worlds. And three, you reposition land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. Colonialism is fundamentally a story of violence, a teeming, inventive life on earth decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien, a vital, vibrant planet rendered into desolate landscapes of cracked and crushed earth, an ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery and empire. So much of history remains grounded in the internal histories of the West and the biosciences. The power and enduring legacy of colonialism is best captured by the term coloniality. As Edward Glisson argues, West is not a place, it is a project. Colonialism wasn't a historical blip or moment in history, but an enduring installation, an infrastructure of coloniality, epistemologies, methodologies, and methods. Coloniality's infrastructure, grounded on race and gender, erased and marginalized other modes of social organization and myriad local systems of knowing the world over. One of the key insights of feminist work on the sciences is that even though nature is consistently gendered feminine, such as Mother Nature, biology has persistently shaped the workings of nature as masculine and patriarchal. The rise of botany transposed colonial visions of binary sex and gender, compulsory heterosexuality, and Eurocentrism onto nature. No surprise then that there is more scientific work on competition than on cooperation, more on conflict than on coexistence, more on the battle between the sexes than of joyful cooperative living. Science, in short, has transformed the majestic, deep history of time into the reductionist linear time of botany. Botany does not think with plants and fungi, I contend. Colonial thought has remade plant images in their image. How might we undo these histories to examine, critique, and reimagine? Here I do it by queering botany. challenging heterosexuality and reproductive heteronormity that grounds our politics of identity and place. Queer studies emphasizes the necessity of thinking about sexuality, not in terms of the body or identity, but as fields of power. Queer is also a verb and centralist method to make strange and to question what we know. To think, read, or act queerly is to think across boundaries, beyond the normal and the normative, to explore the spaces deemed marginal, vulnerable, precarious, and perverse, to celebrate, in Angie Willie's words, queer feminist desires for new modes of conceptualization and new forms of belonging. In queering our politics of place, I'm aiming to challenge a biology that claims to be value neutral and apolitical. In queering nature, we see how biology is rooted not in land, but in colonial scripts. I focus on the stories we tell about place. I take you through a deep history of time to challenge binary claims of native and foreign. To do this, I offer you an elegy in prose. I offer it as a serious reflection on the term invasive species, who they are, where they come from, what they do, why they are, and what we can do to move forward. An elegy, a lament for the slandered, maligned, loathed, and reviled life condemned to the gallows. They have earned the official and violent moniker of invasive species. Their main villainy? They are not native to the arbitrary borders of nations. These doomed foreigners face campaigns of extermination, a drawn-out ecocide through poisons, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, to be burned, scorched, or singed by fire, to be mauled through mowing, hoeing, tilling, chopping. Finding themselves in foreign lands, they are now the accused and accursed. And most did not come on their own. They were brought here by centuries of human agency, through generations of migration, forced and voluntary, the extractive regimes of colonial exploration, the circuits of capitalism and economic globalization, through serendipity and the gentle hands of the curious and adventurous. They were chosen because they were beautiful, useful, unique, spicy, or just weird. Some were the chosen ones, desired, showcased, bred, and controlled. They adorned living rooms, front yards, colorful gardens, produce in grocery stores, dried spices in the aisles. They were processed, canned, juiced, frozen, and transported to the ends of the earth. Agricultural plants were hijacked, subjected to harsh regimes to thrill the quirky minds of breeders. Crossbred and cross-pollinated with wild genetic abandon within an increasingly species lines, they are now commodities and properties. A flounder gene in a tomato, a lightning bug gene in a tobacco plant? Sure, why not? There are no ethical or sacred lines in genetic engineering for non-human life. An infinite number of organisms have been bred for mutations and mutants to please the master. Plants are reimagined through colonialism as botany, the deep time of plants compressed into the regimes of human time and capital. They were reimagined as gentlemen and ladies on nuptial beds, as husbands and wives. Their reproductive parts reimagined as human genitalia. As you will see in terms of plant reproductive parts, there's a one-to-one correspondence with human genitalia and plant genitalia. Inhabited lands were deemed terra nullis, where colonists discovered and renamed plants long known to locals. Generation after generation, they were used, then abandoned and reviled. So many tales to tell. Kudzu, first exhibited as an ornamental, was adopted by the USDA and given to willing farmers who were paid to plant kudzu on their impoverished land to nourish the soil and prevent soil erosion. When they grew luxuriously, they were rendered dangerously invasive. So with the Amur honeysuckle, Japanese knotweed, Japanese barberry. Lady Hastings, the wife of the first British Governor General, introduced the water hyacinth into India for its beauty. Today, it is the invasive terror of Bengal. Purple loosestrife, introduced for its ornamental and medicinal use, is now deemed invasive. Yet others were imported for biological control, vilified when experiments failed. The list goes on: garlic mustard, Phragmites, tamarisk, Japanese honeysuckle, Chinese privet, and the curiously named tree of heaven. A vast majority were brought here not by lay people, but trained by biological scientists, plant explorers, horticulturalists, agriculturalists, plant breeders, ecologists, and forest managers. This was the hubris of science and scientists gone awry. And yet the victims are not science or scientists, but the organisms that were willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly, through guile or persuasion, through greed and desire, invited into the borders of imagined nations. Thinking contemporary invasion biology alongside colonial botany reveals a profound biological amnesia. During colonial rule, there was a laissez-faire attitude and unlimited mobility across borders. As Alfred Crosby argues, the roots of European domination of Western world lies in their creating new Europes wherever they went. Settler colonists ravaged native populations of humans, plants, and animals. Where Europeans went, their agriculture and animals went. They thrived while indigenous ecosystems collapsed. Capitalist logics fueled a global flora, a mass export of resources out of the colony, and growing ravages of the environment through unchecked industrialization and development. For example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the USA had an active program that sent biologists as explorers to roam the globe to find different plants. Dr. David Fairchild himself introduced more than 200,000 species and varieties into the United States. Likewise, the American Acclimatization Society introduced all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's works into New York Central Park. I mean, why not? Such an open policy was indeed the norm until late in the 19th century. White settlers remade themselves as the natives and enacted strict border policies to exclude the foreign. A plant and animal quarantine laws developed literally alongside human exclusion acts. A biological reckoning means undoing botany's theories of global flora to unravel the coloniality of biogeography, a profound recognition that frameworks of nature in and out of place are political constructions, fossilizing particular evolutionary ecological moments as true native nature for posterity. Botanical nostalgia is fundamentally an unecological project. First, the lament, and now for praise and celebration. The accursed species did not comply. Species brought to be exploited refused to follow the master's plans. As many writers have wonderfully chronicled, hundreds of species thrived in their new lands. They covered damaged and destroyed land and greened ruined landscapes of bare earth. They offered bountiful produce, but the new natives did not recognize them as food, so they grew unchecked. They grew in cracks and crevices of urban cities, islands of rich biodiversity in the most unusual places. They challenged the false claims of an idyllic past to produce rambunctious gardens and rural cities, new salvific narratives of the new wild, healing guides for the toxic modernity of the Anthropocene. Other foreign species came as beloved companions to humans, creating multi-species embrangled communities, a transnational, transhistorical palimpsest of life and living. When humans pillaged the land, they nourished and enriched the land. What can we offer but praise for their tenacity? An elegy for invasive species. First the lament, then the praise and celebration, and now for consolation and solace. A vast literature reminds us that invasive species are not the problem, but the symptom of a much larger problem. Unchecked development, exploitative environmental policy, unbridled capitalist greed, rapacious growth to feed the gods of modernity. In fact, the distribution of naturalized species across the world today are a direct product of the histories of European colonialism, a legacy that has indelibly shaped and structured all contemporary ecosystems. The continued destruction of habitats, the willful refusal to deal with the devastating impact of climate change means we have already passed the point of no return. What does it mean to save native species, seeds, and geographies when there are no longer native environments? If we think with plants, something different emerges. Study after study chronicle how natives, along with early and new migrants, have at times created novel environments, indeed novel natures. The complex history of mobility, motility, and migrations of multi-species biologies is the story of our planet, its past, present, and future. How can we jettison the unhelpful, unproductive language of native and foreign? In thinking about the binary male and female, Madeline Bartlett and I suggest We understand plant morphology and anatomy not through human genitalia, but plants themselves. We suggest abandoning male and female, either rejecting sex and gender altogether or re-theorizing them as quantitative traits. How can we distance ourselves from colonial theories about plant origins? Just as humans are more than a few races, plants are more than the binary native and foreign. They have complex histories and biologies. Rather than native and invasive ecologies, I suggest we move to migrant ecologies. Here I propose 5 questions we should ask to replace the binary of native and alien as we face our planetary futures in a fast-changing world and facing climate change. Before we go headlong into eradication as the obvious response to the presence of invasive species, let us think with plants, asking what, where, when, who, and why. Let us approach it with curiosity, responsibility, and accountability. What is the question, issue, or problem we are addressing? Invasive species rhetoric is often monolithic, broad, and unnuanced. Plants are marked as bad actors in need of eradication. But most often, the issues facing different sites vary considerably. In fact, there is no single invasive species problem narrative. In some cases, it's economic loss, a problem of aesthetics, the impact of beloved native species or ecosystem, and sometimes about biodiversity, species diversities. These are not equivalent issues, and it would behoove us to clearly name the problem without a one-size-fits-all solution of total eradication. Where is the question, issue, or problem? Invasive species rhetoric looms large as a problem because it has been framed as a universal one, the same problem worldwide. Vast histories, biologies, and ecologies are collapsed into a universal framing. But asking questions about the ecological geography, historical, and environmental context of individual plants or animals is critical. Surely the issue in a desert or wetland, small island or mainland, coast or inland, mountain peak or valley are wildly different. Surely the varied histories, ecologies, and biologies of habitat and organisms lead to very different adaptive futures. When are we talking about? How does time shape the question, issue, or problem we are addressing? When did the plant emerge in this space? Always recognizing that many invasive species have long existed in very small numbers before they turn invasive. The question most often is why now? Taking questions of when helps us understand and question the invasive species narrative as inevitable, and instead helps us focus on the temporality of invasion. When is also a deeply, profoundly historical question. We must consider the histories that brought a plant into particular geographic spaces in particular moments. Who are we talking about? Whose questions, issues, or problems are we addressing? All genera are not the same. All species or individuals are not the same. Who is the organism? How did it find itself in this place? What kind of life history characteristics does it have? How is it propagated? How is its pollen dispersed? How are its seeds dispersed? Who are the local humans and what do they want? How do complex nature cultural histories link plant diasporas and human diasporas? Whose histories, cultures, and biologies should we reckon with? Finally, why do we find ourselves here? Which colonial histories have ushered us into this moment? Which political genealogies bring us here? Why this plant? What were the conditions of possibility that led to its invasiveness? Inevitably, the why offers rich nature cultural history filled with human hubris. In conclusion, instead of a universal monolithic rhetoric of invasive species, I suggest we begin to think with plants through their nature cultural histories and the what, where, when, who, and why. The story of plant life is the story of Pangaea, the supercontinent that fractured into continental formations, moving species and leading to dizzying evolutionary adaptations. Then in a flash of planetary time, colonialism reknit the seams of Pangaea. Biological exchange and movement created a world-spanning economic system. In this deep history of time and the evolutionary histories of humans out of Africa, who is native and foreign? The embrangled story of life on Earth is not singular or universal, but complex and multiple. Some live where they were born, but others, like me, are shaped by generations of migrations. My grandparents, parents, my sister, and I are all migrants through and through. There is nothing innocent about this. Complex history shaped those migrations. As the quip often goes, We are here because you were there. Migrations have been forced, coerced, and voluntary. These are tales of abjections, enslavement, victimization, but also ones of opportunity, adventure, celebration, and joy. Primarily trained as an evolutionary biologist, life on Earth for me is never about stasis or being rooted in one place, literally or metaphorically. In Lewis Carroll's Red Queen's famous words, it takes all the running you can to keep in the same place. Inspired by Charles Darwin, I dreamed in a polyphonic, polymorphic biological imagination. Growing up in post-independent, multi-religious India, life was about plurality. In my lifetime, I have been stunned by the rise of an insular nativism and nationalism in both the country of my birth and now citizenship, a violent, virulent xenophobia, human and non-human alike. Even more remarkable is that in both nations, the majority claim victimhood from the minority. While the biota of the world has been profoundly shaped by colonialism, migrant life did not begin with European colonialism. Humans, animal, plants have always moved. After all, in the deep history of life on Earth, who belongs where? Life evolves through the everyday, through peace and tumult, through greed and grace. Pathologizing or celebrating natives and aliens misses the complex colonial histories that have shaped human, animal, plant, and fungal life. None are immune to this history, and we ignore them at our peril. We do have the tools to address our embrangled histories. In addressing ecological problems, biologists already have rich information. Environmental historians offer multiple genealogies of the problem. Post-colonial, decolonial, and indigenous scholars chronicle complex analysis of the legacies that have brought us here. Literary scholars deploy a robust language of rhetorics and counter-rhetorics. Feminist, queer, and crip scholars remind us of the gendered, racialized, and ableist underpinnings of these nature cultural histories. Once freed from their disciplinary silos of purity, a promiscuous, polymorphic, interdisciplinary approach is precisely what we need to remind us that we are impure beings in impure nations with impure histories and genealogies. We should revel in impurity, embrace it as central to our politics, our methodologies and methods. What we need are impure politics, impure theories for impure times. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Banu, for this thought-provoking presentation. I have several questions, but I would like to open it for the audience in a little bit. I have the gift to have the opportunity to give you some of my ideas. And so in your work, as you can see, I'm following your work, and I'm a big fan of your scholarship. And in your work, you say that decolonization is not a singular project. It's dynamic, it's an ongoing process with indigenous and other racialized and colonized communities. It's also an intentional move towards social justice. But something that really struck me and I resonated with is that you said that decolonization is an engaged, a reflexive praxis. And I was wondering, as someone that has been working with communities and using participatory action research, I was wondering, what does praxis looks for you? What does it look for you? And is it activism? Is it working with communities to build a research agenda? What does it look at? What the methodologies and methods have been helpful for you in your own experience?
That's a great question, and I think you should answer it as well, because I think you are working on the ground. Would you like to share what praxis means to you?
Okay. Okay. Oh, this is a conversation. So
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Well, as Rachel mentioned, I have been working with a community in Colombia for 8-9 years, and using participatory action research has translated to two ways for me. The first one is that the community, it's the one who's leading the research project from the proposal, when I'm conducting the research on the field, and also the dissemination. So they have been part of these three phases, but also my role as a scholar within their own project. So they're claiming this, particularly right now, they're claiming a sacred mountain in the city. So my role has been the scholar certifying, even though I hate that word, but for the state, they need an anthropologist certifying that they're indigenous community. So my role has been that, like kind of the bridge between the community and the state, but they're always been present in all the spaces where I have been. So that's kind of like where I have been.
That's wonderful. And I guess I do work with people insofar as biologists, but I don't work on the ground. And so my work in thinking about decolonization has really been about examining the history of colonial botany, of trying to understand where our ideas come from, and being a bit, so I grew up in India and I studied the same colonial botany all of you studied. And so some of it, for me, a study in botany was really such an alienation from the world I knew, because I knew plants by their individual names, and often in most other, and I suspect this is true of English too, in terms of the common word we have for plants, they describe the plant, right? It's not named after some dead white explorer or colonist or queen or military general. And so those descriptors that I knew in a local tongue get completely erased when you come into a botanical education. And even when some local name is used, it becomes Latinized, so it doesn't feel like you recognize it. And I think one of the first steps we can do is, I think, open up language again. I don't see why we should all be speaking Latin to each other. I think scientists who want to can do it, but I think it would open up plant and animal worlds and the natural worlds if we can speak in our local languages. And in this day, with this possibility of translation, why we can't have multiple languages across the world, everyone using the words that they know, and that those words really, I think, also have a relationship with people, as opposed to some colonist who named the plants what they have. So to me, I've been thinking about the ways, in thinking about my own biological education, and the ways in which these colonial scripts shaped a world I saw, I knew, I loved, I played with, what then became alien through a biological education. And as I think any of you start thinking through it, it's layers after layers after layers. But the point is that often colonialism also was very appropriative. It took indigenous knowledge and made it part of science. So the point is not about saying we need to throw away science or botany, because there is also wisdom in it. There are many histories in it, many genealogies in it, much botanical knowledge through these colonial exploits. So it's a complex process of what decolonization means. And for me, it's never about, I don't think it's we will ever decolonize. But the point is asking those questions and the processes of where ideas come from. And that ultimately we are not only entangled with life, we are embrangled in histories and genealogies and anthropologies and sociologies. And so we really need all the intellectual and methodological tools that academia offers for us to do this project together.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. So something that, and this is connected to this question, something that I've learned through your work is that telling stories about plants is talking about justice. It's about talking about epistemic justice, ecological justice. And you use the notion of remembering from Toni Morrison, and which encompasses affective experiences and help us to recognize what you refer, and you talk about botanical amnesia, but also help us to imagine other futures. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more and the relationship between this notion of remembering and imagination within the coloniality of botany or the coloniality of nature.
Sure. So in the book Botany of Empire, I use Toni Morrison in Beloved introduces this word rememory, and the idea being that you don't just remember, that to remember, memory can also be about resituating those experiences, reanalyzing the past in new kinds of ways. And so to me, I feel, at least I'm not trained as a historian. I think it's appalling that I got a PhD in biology with knowing very little about the history of biology. And in fact, I don't, at least for me in my experience, when those of us in a biology PhD program wanted to take courses in the history and philosophy of science, in my case, my advisor signed my papers, but there were many colleagues where the advisor said, if you have so much time, spend more time in the lab or spend more time in the field. And there is a very active mode of preventing interdisciplinary knowledge, and it's such a shame. And I feel I've had to spend so much of my life understanding things that had I had an interdisciplinary education from the beginning would have been much more synthetic. So really for me, the project of rethinking biology is a remembering project, right? Because it is connecting the histories I learned in biology with what else, the context in which that knowledge developed. In my first book, Ghost Stories for Darwin, so my doctoral work was on morning glory flower color variation and trying to understand why so many different flowers had been selected for. And so I would go to the greenhouse, do my crosses, do my field work. Then I would take a bus to the other campus where I would take my women's studies courses that were very, very separate. Until one day I was having coffee with a colleague, Mary Wire, who said, oh, what do you work on? And usually when feminists ask me that, I would start and they'd say, oh, very nice, very nice. And then we would move to other things. But Mary said, no, I really want to know. What do you work on? And so I explained it. And then at the end, she just nodded with perfect comprehension. She said, oh, you work on diversity. Until that moment, I had never connected variation, which was the center of evolutionary biology, with diversity, which I was studying in my women's studies classes, and that there might be a connection. And so that led me to explore the history of biology. And it takes 2 seconds and you hit the history of eugenics, if you're looking at history of evolutionary biology or population genetics. And all the key theorists, biologists I studied in my class were key figures in that eugenics debate. And the eugenics debate is not, we now, I think, largely think of it through Nazi eugenics. But in fact, eugenics was a very capacious movement. It was a biologist on the left who said, how can we use scientific knowledge to produce a better and more diverse society? And others who said, oh, a good society is Beethoven and Mozart and Einstein. And there were key biologists who I used in my work who had this debate, none of which I studied in my biological classes. In my women's studies classes, I learned about eugenics, but never about biology, right? And so much of remembering is about repairing, connecting these histories that different people have written. When I did graduate school, I had to take a road between the two. At UMass, there is a pond between so at each institutions, geographies are separated. To do interdisciplinary work means crossing campus or taking a bus to another campus. And in my cynical moments, I think this is not accidental. I think there is a reason why when we stay myopic within our individual disciplines, we produce very specialized knowledge, never making the connections that are at the heart of all our disciplines, that I think all disciplines have been shaped by these colonial inquiries.
Thank you so much. I think we're running out of time, but please stay for the following panel, which is also incredible. So, we're gonna go for coffee break. Sorry.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.